Guten Tag. Uh, I did some thinking about it, and I'm going to do the presentation on the labor army as a form of state slavery, particularly a racialized one. But I'm not really going to do a comparison to chattel slavery in the New World. Uh, One of these things is it's difficult to do these types of comparisons, and uh, because you often end up comparing apples to oranges and get a comparison of fruit. Obviously, my specific knowledge, particularly with regard to primary source materials, is certainly much greater in the case of Soviet state slavery, ethnic Germans mobilized into the labor army, than it is regarding various forms of slavery imposed upon elements of the African diaspora in the New World. But I think theoretically we can look at uh, this as both racialized and that the category of nationalnost had become one that was permanent, it was immutable, unchangeable, and automatically passed down to the next generation. And that in the case of the Germans and other punished peoples in the Soviet Union, that it signified inherently and negative traits based upon an immutable and essentialized ancestry. And that this had been certainly the case hardened into Soviet law as early as April of 1938, when the NKVD, during the German operation, made it impossible to change one's nationality in order to avoid persecution during this mass witch hunt for quote unquote German spies, which uh, disproportionately targeted ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. And I talked about that in my series that I did, but uh, to go over, there was a disproportionate number of Germans targeted for arrest and execution during the German operation on the basis that being the descendant of German immigrants, German being defined primarily by language here, since Germany didn't exist until 1871, and these people were migrating from smaller German-speaking states such as Baden-Württemberg, or parts of larger states that were obviously not Germany, Alsace and France, parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We see already that it's reached a point where the Nationalnost has moved from an ethnic designation into an ethno-racial designation. That is one that is based upon ancestry and unchangeable. So I wanted to specifically deal with the labor army in 1941, really to 1948, although there are obviously ramifications beyond 1948, but most of the people forcibly conscripted into the labor army are released by 1948, although not all of them, which is why in some senses the date is arbitrary. Uh, so what happened during the Second World War within the context of mobilization for labor of people against their will, the use of a militarized system to conscript people and then turn them over to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs to work in Soviet labor camps, but also for civilian commissariats as a form of forced labor. Shows that while the Germans were not the only people that were subjected to forced labor, that in many ways they were singled out. Uh, and what we see here is that of the two large labor armies uh, that are constructed by the Soviets during the Second World War, one of them is predominantly German, uh, something like 78%. And in the camps, uh, Germans in the labor army range from something around 86% to over 98% of the labor army conscripts working in work columns in these corrective labor camps administered by the Gulag. So let's look at the labor mobilization. I don't have exact numbers, but the number that you see for mobilization for people that are among the repressed, deported peoples uh, is around 400,000, of which 182,000 or so end up working in labor camps. Now, of this number, some 315,000 are ethnic Germans, so that means around 85,000 are non-Germans, and the 30,000 or so repressed kulaks, uh, some 5,000 Crimean Tatars, a number of Hungarians, Romanians, Italians, and especially Finns that were citizens of the Soviet Union that are mobilized because these countries are allies of Germany. A number of Kalmucks, Koreans, Bulgarians, and Greeks that are citizens of the Soviet Union as well. But all told, right, of the 400,000, over three-quarters, 315,000, are ethnic Germans that are citizens of the Soviet Union. And the other groups are much smaller. Now, one reason, of course, is there are fewer of them. Another reason is that far more Germans are targeted. Some 30% of the entire adult population end up being forcibly conscripted. And this is because the Soviets conscript not only men, but also adolescents. They go down to 15 years of age instead of 17 for other nationalities. For men, they go up to 55 instead of 50 for other nationalities. But the big thing to why there's so many more ethnic Germans, percentage-wise, forcibly conscripted in the labor army during the Second World War, is that women are subject to conscription as well as men. And this is not the case with the other repressed peoples, Koreans, Kalmucks, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Greeks, Finns. In these cases, only men are subjected to mobilization for forced labor. All right. And the other labor army, in terms of numbers, is quite large. It's also about equal, about 400,000. It doesn't get as early a start, and it is dismantled earlier. So it's really only from October 1942 to 1944. And it is representatives of the much larger Central Asian population, not just the indigenous Central Asians, but certainly ethnic Uzbeks and Kazakhs, the two largest components of this. But they are not subjected to the same harsh material norms of the Gulag that are imposed upon the Germans. And they are given a number of other privileges But mostly, with note here, even though the total number here is quite large, we're talking about 150,000 Uzbeks and perhaps even more Kazakhs. Uh, how many of those uh, we have here? But it should be noted that obviously from much larger population, there's over 4 million Uzbeks versus only a million ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union at this time. And that as far as conscription is concerned, the larger number of people being conscripted from the Central Asian nationalities are being sent to the Red Army to fight, where conditions are not great, but they're considerably better than what the ethnic Germans are experiencing in the labor camps in the Urals. So let's look how this works. The first mobilization in the labor army of ethnic Germans occurs out of eastern Ukraine, an attempt to prevent German men who are of fighting age from coming under the Nazi occupation, so that the Nazis cannot conscript ethnic Germans that are Soviet citizens into their own military. So it's men 16 to 60 in eastern Ukraine, and it's about 18,600, and they are sent to labor battalions into the eastern areas of the Soviet Union in August 1941. And the next group are ethnic Germans that are fighting in the Soviet Red Army. Ultimately, this number would total about 30,000, mostly Volga Germans that are demobilized from the Soviet Red Army and sent to work columns in the labor army as forced laborers. This is, we'll get to this, but this is one of the things with documents here. We see clearly the racial motive. Why the punishment is decided on a purely ethnic rather than a political basis by the Soviet government. Political loyalty, membership in the Communist Party, service to the Soviet state are irrelevant in terms of their punishment of the ethnic Germans. The only thing that matters here is their blood, their ancestry, the fact that they are part of an immutable category inherited at birth by ancestry, that is race, of being German. Now, 8 September 1941, the decree removes all ethnic Germans from Soviet military positions. Now, some managed to escape this by changing their names to non-German names, having superior officers vouch that they're not in fact German, but they're Russian. But the mass majority of them, of the 30,000, are forcibly removed and end up in the labor army. But initially, in the last part of 1941, it's not a huge number. Most of them get mobilized in 1942 with the bulk of the labor army. So by the beginning of January 1942, there's only about a little over 20,000 ethnic Germans in these 4th Labor Battalions that are the core of the labor army. And then there are the 3 very large decrees. The first applying only to ethnic German men who were deported from western regions of the Soviet Union to Siberia and Kazakhstan. In total, around 800,000 people, around half to Kazakhstan, northern oblast of that republic, and half mainly to western Siberia, but about 75,000 to Krasnoyarsk Krai in eastern Siberia. And the men are subjected to forced mobilization starting in 10th of January 1942. And originally, the Soviet government wants to conscript 120,000 ethnic Germans, send them for industrial construction and felling of trees and building of railroads, mostly in the Urals. Oh, but there is one lumber camp in Krasnoyarsk, Kraslog, that is on the list of places to receive mobilized Germans at this time. Because local authorities, particularly in Kazakhstan, want to keep a number of the deported Germans because of their skilled labor on the kolkhozes, the tractor drivers, combine drivers, have other skills related to the operation of agricultural machinery. The Soviet government, the NKVD in particular, but the central government I'm talking here versus the local governments, particularly the Republic government in Almaty, Kazakhstan, is unable to reach its goal of 120,000. It falls short by about 30,000. Only about 90,000 Germans can be conscripted at this time. So it immediately increases the pool of Germans that it desires to uh, forcibly conscript. That is, it expands the number of ethnic Germans that are subject to mobilization and forced labor by including the 200,000 or so ethnic Germans that had been living in Siberia and Kazakhstan and other eastern areas of the Soviet Union, making them subject to mobilization in the labor army. And so this occurs on the 14th of February 1942, and they are able to conscript over 40,000 more ethnic Germans from among the population. So they meet the 120,000 quota. They have over 130,000 ethnic German men forcibly mobilized in these two mobilizations ordered in January 10th of 1942 and again 14th of February 1942. But the death rates are very high, particularly from malnutrition, but of course overwork, inhumane work. Remember, the first mobilizations are occurring in January, and then in February it's winter, so hypothermia is a problem in the Urals and Siberia. Accidents, industrial work sites, laying of foundations, um, felling trees, timber. These are very dangerous work of large numbers of fatalities compared to many other types of labor, but particularly this is some of the most dangerous physical labor at the time. And because the Soviets are not putting any interest in the safety and well-being of the ethnic Germans, they're punishing them, and they are forcing a breakneck speed as possible, although it's difficult given things like malnutrition and exposure weakening the workforce, particularly making them susceptible to disease, living in overcrowded and unsanitary barracks without access to proper medical care. Obviously, morbidity rates, weakness due to hunger and disease, and of course, mortality rates are all quite high. And so this shrinks the number of German labor army workers, both those that die in the camps uh, during the winter, spring, and summer of 1942, but also those that are just too weak to work anymore and are released, many of them dying shortly after their release as a result of disease, injury, and damage suffered to their physical organism during their stay in the labor camps as labor army conscripts. So they need more people. And this is what 7th of October 1942. They extend the conscription of German men uh, down from 17 for men down to 15. So they are now recruiting teenagers, and they also extend the recruitment from 50 to 55. So older men are now being conscripted, and this nets over 70,000 more ethnic German men. They also extend it to women, and this is not done to any other group. Age 16 to 45 who are not pregnant and do not have children under the age of 3. And so over 50,000 women are forcibly conscripted in the fall of 1942 among the German populations in the Soviet Union, particularly Siberia. There are more labor army conscripts than from Kazakhstan, even though the populations are about equal, 400,000 each. But it appears that about 200,000 of the 300,000 labor army conscripts come from areas outside of Kazakhstan, whereas 100,000 come from Kazakhstan, despite it having uh, 400,000 of the 800,000 deportees, and over 60,000 of the 200,000 local Germans that had been there previously. Uh, and this also leads to the fact that most of the Germans deported to Siberia from the Volga region, and those deported to Kazakhstan from other regions, that there were a larger, disproportionate number of Volga Germans conscripted into the labor army during the war. But I haven't done a real fine, granular analysis of the geographical location, origins before deportation of the conscripts in the labor army. So this is kind of general, but it appears if you read the works I have listed down, even though I'm kind of trying to focus on Kazakhstan and Central Asia, that it looks like only about 100,000 of the 315,000 came from this region. And then Siberia was almost twice as many. All right, so interestingly enough, this occurs before the 14th of October. And the 14th of October, there are two mobilization decrees for labor armies, and neither of them apply to the Germans. The first one is for this punitive labor army that the Germans are being conscripted into by the decrees of 10th of January 1942, 14th of February 1942, and 7th of October 1942. And this decree applies in terms of numbers largest to ethnic Finns in the Soviet Union, that is, people who are Finnish by nationalnost, but Soviet citizens. One of the camps in the Urals gets up to almost 5% of the labor army conscripts that are being Finnish. So compared to 86% or so being German, not a lot. But most of the other camps with labor army contingents, it's over 97, 98% German in the contingent. So that's fairly large. And then, of course, much smaller numbers of Hungarians, Romanians, and Italians. These were all Axis states except for Finland, which was uh, fighting with the Axis, but not a member of the Axis, associate power. But all of them were fighting against the Soviet Union. Finland around Leningrad area, the Hungarians, Romanians, and Italians with the main German forces coming in the south end up being defeated at Stalingrad. So this adds a little bit with regard to the Finns, but not a huge amount. And it doesn't affect uh, men under 17, men over 50, and most notably, no women. The other decree targets people in Central Asia. Now, it's not just the indigenous nationalities. At this time, Kyrgyzstan is less than half Kyrgyz, and many of the labor army conscripts that end up working in Kyrgyzstan itself are not ethnically Kyrgyz. They're Jewish, Ukrainian, other nationalities that were living there. Uh, but it does bring into the Urals a number of workers, over 150,000 from Uzbekistan, an equal number from Kazakhstan. But the thing should be noted is that they are given extra rations, particularly mutton, bread, rice, that are not available to the other labor army. They are given reduced work hours when it's cold, where there's a minimum 8 hours of work, no matter how cold it is, for the German. The Central Asians, if it's cold enough, can get away with working only 4 hours a day. And something I just really found out, I had thought that they had been kept to the end of the war, which would have meant that they were, in effect, released from labor duties before the Germans, most of whom were kept until 1948. But evidently they weren't kept that long. Evidently most of them were released and allowed to go home in 1944. So really, it's a much smaller period of time, 1942, 1944, about 2 years. Uh, Whereas for most of the ethnic Germans, 1942 to 1948, the 6 years of labor for in the camps in the Urals. So there is that difference in terms of when the punishment stops for the ethnic Germans versus when labor obligations are over for Central Asian recruits for factory work during the Second World War. So those are pretty key differences, I think. The percentage of the overall population, the ages of subjects to conscription, the gender division, the fact that ultimately we see over 84,000 German women end up being forcibly conscripted into the labor army during the Second World War, of which over 21,500 actually work in labor camps. And this does not occur to any other nationality in the Soviet Union. The time the obligations are up, right? Most of the Germans having to work still in the camps until 1948, long after Nazi Germany has been defeated. The Central Asian recruits being able to go home in 1944, 4 years earlier, but they were recruited later too, so their total service is much shorter. And of course, the ration difference, much higher rations for the Central Asian recruits, including indigenous foods like rice, flatbread, naan, mutton, and shorter working hours in extreme cold. One of the things that should be noted is that uh, while there were obviously Germans that were not recruited, only 30% of the total population, because it was not only on the basis of ethno-racial category, but also being an able-bodied adult. So obviously children under the age of 15 were generally not conscripted, but there are a number of cases in the archives we found of children younger than the Germans. But for the most part, obviously, if we get below 12 or 13, they're not conscripting, even by mistake, ethnic Germans that are that young. People that are quite old, and people that are frail, invalids, completely incapable of doing heavy work, felling trees, mining coal, building industrial complexes from the foundation up. These people obviously are part of the two-thirds of the German population of the Soviet Union uh, that are not forcibly conscripted into the labor army during the Second World War. And finally, of course, women who have small children. Now, this means 1 and 2 years old. Uh, there were quite a few women that had children older than that that are conscripted, but those with very small children were exempted. Right, so those are formed some 66 to 70% of the German population that remained special settlers in Kazakhstan and Siberia rather than being conscripted into the labor army. But even so, 30 to 33%, very high percentage, certainly much higher percentage of any other group uh, to be subjected to this type of uh, forced labor. State slavery is described by a number of places, and I'm going to use that term here as well. I don't see any reason to uh, give the Soviet dictatorship under Stalin a break here. It was state slavery, and like earlier forms of slavery, it was also, as we can see, racially uh, targeted toward ethnic Germans. And I wanted to read a clarification that was issued by Gulag regarding the ethnic Germans. In this case, there was an attempt by superior officers of a former German soldier in the Red Army to get him removed from the Labor Army and get him sent back to the ranks. And there's a clarification from Gulag on 5th of June 1942. So I'll read the translation into English, which is my own. Independent of rank in the Red Army, position in the reserves, party membership, election to party and Soviet post, etc., all Germans, in accordance with the decree of the State Committee of Defense, are mobilized into work columns for the duration of the war. All right, so it doesn't matter loyalty to the Soviet Union. Communist Party membership, irrelevant. Post in the Soviet state or Communist Party, irrelevant. Membership in the Red Army, position there as an officer, irrelevant. So this particular soldier, Ave Walther, the Soviet government, Gulag essentially said in no uncertain terms, right? The mobilization of ethnic Germans into the work columns of the labor army, into forced labor, into punitive forced labor, is to be applied to all ethnic Germans on the basis that they are Germans by ancestry and that their service to the Soviet state, their loyalty to the Soviet state, their political attachment to the Soviet state is irrelevant. This is a racialized form of punishment. That there is nothing that they as individuals can do because it has to do entirely with their ancestry and nothing to do with their individual political loyalty. All right, so that was a clarification in June of 1942 by Gulag as to how it interpreted the mobilization orders issued in January and February of that year regarding German men that or Soviet citizens of German Nationalnost that were men between the ages of, at this time it's still 17 and 50 officially, but as I said, in October it gets expanded, and in October it also includes women, and that's the only group that is targeted that way in the Soviet Union for mobilization into the forced labor brigades of the labor army. All right, so I think this has gotten up to over a half hour now, but I think that's enough, I think, to along with the papers I'm going to link to at the bottom here, that you can go and read from my Academia EDU page, that the Soviet mobilization of ethnic Germans into the labor army during the Second World War was a form of racialized state slavery. And somebody who is more knowledgeable about other forms of slavery, perhaps types of chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere during the 19th century, I would encourage them to do comparative work to look at how there are some similarities between these types of cases. But as I said, I've had this discovery, and it came to me while I was trying to do these types of comparisons, forced labor, when I was in Ghana. They are hard to do. You really have to be an expert in all the subjects. You can't just be an expert in one and kind of latch onto another one to compare it to. But I do think that there's enough preliminary evidence here that if somebody did have these types of skills, that it would be well worth looking into. But I think on a theoretical basis, I can definitely say that it's a racialized state slavery. Fortunately, it wasn't permanent, but even so, the 6 years that most of the ethnic German that were mobilized into the labor army in the Soviet Union spent was very traumatic, and a large number of ethnic Germans served in the labor army. Uh, about at least 60,000 either died before they were released from the camps or working for civilian commissariats like coal and oil industry, or died a few weeks, months, years later from damage done to their health because of their uh, confinement and work under these horrible conditions in terms of lack of food, unsanitary and overcrowded barracks, lack of medical attention, inhumane labor, that it certainly shortened their life. So a not large number of those that are released as invalids die very shortly after being released. They don't live even a few months more. So in that sense, there's also that type of human loss, destruction of the physical component of the uh, German ethnos in the Soviet Union by the Stalin regime during the Second World War through the use of forced labor. I'll leave it at that. This obviously, I know, is not a happy subject, but again, uh, I think that for research into history of the Russian Germans into the ethnic group, it can't just all be, well, these are my ancestors. I'm descended directly from these people that were in the Volga and these people in the Ukraine. We have to look at the group holistically and what it went through, and that includes the horrible parts.